When I accepted the offer to join a secret division at NASA, one that few know exists, I had no idea how far my investigation would take me. Slowly, I uncovered buried secrets, forgotten reports, and events that should never have been revealed. Now, something watches me from the shadows. The deeper I dig, the more I realize there are truths that should never be unearthed. My career at NASA had been on a solid path. Years of research in astrobiology and involvement in space missions had given me a sense of purpose that few in my field achieve. However, routine had set in. Even with the grandeur of the discoveries, everything had become predictable. Then I received an unexpected offer, a call that shook my comfort zone and pulled me into the unknown. It was a typical morning. The soft sunlight filtered into my office, and I was buried in graphs and reports. The chime of my email went off, and there it was, a discreet but urgent message. No formal signature, just the NASA logo at the top and a subject line that made my heart race. Invitation to join the Sigilo Division. Sigilo Division? In more than 20 years at NASA, I had never heard of it. The body of the email was brief and direct, summoning me to a meeting in the basement of the headquarters. Intrigued and somewhat suspicious, I checked the authenticity of the message. It was legitimate. After confirming the meeting, I spent the rest of the day restless, my mind racing, imagining what it could mean. A secret division? What kind of work were they talking about? I had worked with some of the agency's biggest secrets, so what could be more classified than that? 2 days later, I was ushered into a room where the windows were sealed by heavy blinds, and the air carried a tension I quickly realized wasn't just my paranoia. In front of me, 3 figures sat silently. A man in a dark suit, who didn't seem to belong to the scientific community, and 2 high-level directors I vaguely recognized from other projects. They watched me as I sat down. The man in the center opened a folder and, silently, pushed a document towards me. "We're offering you a unique opportunity, Doctor." He finally broke the silence. "You've been selected to join the Sigilo Division and review a project that has been forgotten for decades. It's an unofficially documented lunar mission, conducted in the late 60s. Immediately, my heart raced. A lunar mission no one had heard of? Sounded absurd. But the heavy atmosphere in the room indicated that this was real. Why now? Why resurrect something like this? I asked, struggling against my disbelief. Because there's new data and we need your analysis. An anomaly was detected in the last probes we sent to the moon in a specific location. Operation Eclipse, the mission in question, began investigating that area. But something happened. Something unusual. The last sentence hung in the air, and I grasped it with growing curiosity. I couldn't help it. I needed to know more. The man offered me the folder. "You'll have full access to the files once you accept." I accepted on the spot without hesitation. There was something in his words that called to me, something that resonated with what I had been seeking, the unexpected. After all, after so many years of conventional research, finding something unusual in the void of space was the kind of mystery any scientist would dream of solving. Access to the Sigilo Division wasn't immediate. It took 2 days before I received a cryptic phone call with instructions to appear at NASA's headquarters at night, something that had never happened before. Once there, I was led down a hallway I had never noticed, despite working in that building for years. The floors were cold concrete, and the place felt more like a military facility than a research center. Finally, they took me to a locked room deep in the building. A heavy steel door was opened, and I stepped into a small, dimly lit chamber. The smell of old paper and rusted metal filled the air, as if the place hadn't been used in a long time. The shelves were lined with dusty film reels, yellowed file folders, and boxes sealed with restricted access tape. In the center of the room, a metal table was set for me, with a single folder standing out from the clutter. Operation Eclipse. The words were handwritten on the cover of the dossier, and the name hit me like a storm. I had never heard of this mission, and I knew practically every space operation NASA had ever recorded. I sat down, hands slightly trembling, and opened the folder. The first few pages were disappointingly mundane: equipment descriptions, launch reports, logistical instructions. For a moment, I thought it was nothing more than forgotten bureaucracy. But then, halfway through the dossier, something caught my eye. There was a brief mention, almost lost in the text: anomalous structures detected at Shadow Point. Team dispatched for inspection. I stopped and read it again, trying to process what I was seeing. Anomalous structures? What the hell did that mean? I kept flipping through until I found a black and white photo, extremely blurry. It showed what looked like a rock formation, but something about it wasn't natural. Something that seemed artificial. Next to this formation, a group of astronauts posed. Their suits were familiar, but something was wrong with their expressions. Or rather, with the lack of them. The faces were completely blurred. A kind of distortion I couldn't explain. Maybe it was a problem with the photo's development, I thought, but I couldn't shake the growing discomfort settling within me. The file mentioned that this formation was buried beneath the surface, but the details about what they found there were scarce, almost as if they had been intentionally removed. I snapped the dossier shut, the air now heavy with questions. What were those structures? And why were the astronauts' faces blurred like that? Hours turned into days as I buried myself in the Operation Eclipse files. The more I read, the clearer it became that someone or something was trying to erase part of history. There were gaps, torn pages, missing photos, and incomplete reports. Every piece of information seemed to raise more questions than provide answers. But what intrigued me most were the audio tapes. Most of them were severely damaged or cut off in the middle of transmissions, as if the crucial moments had been intentionally removed. When I found the first one, an old, dusty cassette tape marked only with the date July 21st, 1969, a sense of unease crawled down my spine. Could this recording hold the key to understanding what really happened? I plugged the tape into an old recorder I found in the back of a cabinet in the archive room. The initial sound was distorted, with a hiss of static that felt almost alive. I adjusted the controls, trying to reduce the noise, and finally, a voice emerged. Confirming landing, lunar soil is. The voice was familiar, perhaps one of the astronauts whose names I had reviewed in the documentation. His speech was procedural, calm, as it should be, but there was a slight tremor in his tone, something that made me stop and listen more closely. After a few seconds of silence, a different sound began to creep into the recording. At first, I thought it was just interference, but soon it became clear that it was something more. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a muffled whisper. "Are you picking that up?" the astronaut's voice asked, sounding tense. A brief pause. It's too quiet. Then, a burst of static interrupted the response. He tried again. "I repeat, we're hearing something. Sounds on the radio. What is that?" The rest of the recording was consumed by static. I kept turning the volume knob, desperately trying to hear beyond the interference, but it was no use. The audio had become a sea of hissing, as if the recording had been purposely damaged to cover something up. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples, trying to make sense of it all. Faster than my thoughts could process, my mind began to fill with images. Astronauts on the lunar surface, isolated in the vastness of space, hearing something they weren't supposed to. Voices on the radio. Could it be a technical failure? Or was there something else? Something there on the dark side of the moon trying to make contact? I tried listening to other tapes. All followed a similar pattern. interrupted transmissions, voices cut off mid-sentence, and, in 1 or 2 cases, a background sound that resembled something more organic. As if something was whispering amidst the static. As the hours passed, the whispers began to haunt me. Even after turning off the tapes, I felt as though the sound persisted in my mind. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the long hours and exhaustion affecting my perception. But the night that followed, the unease escalated. I lay in bed, exhausted, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, but my mind couldn't shut off. The images of the anomalous structures, the astronauts posing with blurred expressions, and those tapes danced before me. Then, in the deep silence of my room, I heard the first whisper. It was faint, barely a noise, but it made me open my eyes immediately. I sat up in bed, heart racing. I stayed there, motionless, trying to catch some sound again. The wind outside, perhaps? A sound from the walls? Everything seemed quiet. I lay back down, my muscles tense. Just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time, a little clearer, like a distant echo of a human voice. A prolonged whisper, without words I could make out. But that seemed to approach and vanish quickly, like waves crashing on a dark shore. I got up, unable to stay still. My apartment was completely empty. I walked down the hallway, checking the windows, listening carefully for any sign that confirmed what I thought I was hearing. Nothing. I returned to bed, now with my mind disturbed. The voices weren't coming from outside. I was certain of that. They were inside me, as if something had been planted while I listened to those tapes. I tried to rationalize, arguing with myself that it was just a combination of fatigue and obsession with what I had discovered. But deep down, a voice, much stronger than any I could hear outside my mind, told me I was wrong. Something or someone was trying to make contact. In the days that followed, things worsened. The more I tried to unravel the secrets of the recordings, the more present the whispers became, not just at night, but during the day, in moments of silence at my office or even while driving. It was as if an invisible presence was with me, watching, waiting for something. Then I realized, it wasn't just me trying to piece together what had happened during Operation Eclipse. Something was piecing me back together. Something the astronauts brought back with them from that dark cave on the far side of the moon, and now it was here, among us. After days of relentless research, unsettling whispers, and sleepless nights, a new idea took hold of my mind. If someone or something was hiding the truth about Operation Eclipse, there might be one person who could give me the answers that the files had omitted. I knew, from the few documents that hadn't been completely erased or destroyed, that of the 6 astronauts who participated in the mission, only one was still alive. His name was William Harris, one of the crew members. The others were all dead, most from natural causes, or at least that's what the records claimed. Harris, however, had disappeared from the public eye shortly after his return. Now, over 80 years old, he lived reclusively in a small coastal town in California. No one knew much about him except that he had cut ties with practically everyone he knew, including former colleagues in NASA. Still, I managed to get his address through internal contacts. A small cottage far from everything, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. I knew that going there, finding Harris, was my only chance to understand what really happened on the moon. There was something he had seen, something he knew, that had forced him to hide from the world. I was determined to find out what it was. The trip to Harris's house was long, and the isolation of the place added an extra layer of discomfort. I arrived in the early afternoon, under a cloudy sky that looked ready to burst at any moment. The house itself was small, with peeling paint and windows covered by heavy curtains. At first glance, it looked abandoned, but there were signs of life. An old truck parked beside it and a small, overgrown garden with weeds sprouting everywhere. I knocked on the door, my heart racing. For several minutes, the sound of the wind and waves crashing against the distant cliff were my only company. Just as I was about to knock again, the door opened, revealing a hunched man with white hair and eyes that, although tired, still carried an intensity that made me hesitate for a moment. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "Mr. Harris? My name is Jonathan. I work for NASA," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm researching Operation Eclipse, and I need to know what really happened during that mission. I need to understand." For a moment, I thought he was going to shut the door in my face. His eyes studied me deeply, and I could feel a shadow of recognition. He knew what I was talking about, but something in him resisted. Then, he sighed heavily and opened the door, gesturing for me to come inside. The house was dark and filled with accumulated clutter. The smell of mildew permeated the air. Harris moved slowly to a chair in the corner of the room and sat down, never taking his eyes off me. There was no offer of coffee, not even the usual polite small talk. The atmosphere was tense, and the presence of something unspoken hung in the air, as heavy as the clouds outside. "So, you want to know what happened?" he finally murmured, as if speaking to himself. "Yes," I replied, taking a seat in front of him. "I found some files, but they're incomplete. Something was removed or hidden. I think you're the only person who can tell me the truth." He laughed, a dry and bitter sound that echoed through the room. "The truth? You think the truth is in the files?" He shook his head, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "They'd never let the truth get out. Not then, not now." There was a long silence. Harris rubbed his face with his hands, clearly struggling with something. For a moment, I thought he was about to confess everything, but then he abruptly changed the subject. "You've listened to the tapes, haven't you?" He looked directly at me for the first time since I had arrived, his eyes seeming to pierce through my mind. I nodded, unable to speak. "The voices, we heard them from the start. When we landed, there was something there, something on the radio, voices that weren't ours." His breathing grew heavier, and his eyes narrowed. "And the worst is that they keep going. Keep going." My voice barely came out. "What do you mean by that?" But Harris, instead of answering directly, suddenly stood up, a quick and unexpected movement for a man of his age. He shot me a look full of panic, as if he had just realized, in that very moment, that he had told me too much. "Go away," he said brusquely, pointing to the door. "I shouldn't have said anything. They'll know. They always know." "Wait," I pleaded, standing up, trying to grasp at something, anything that would give me more answers. "Please, Harris, what do you mean by they keep going? What did you find there?" He approached me with a desperate expression, his aged face contorted in a mixture of fear and anger. "You don't understand, kid," he whispered, his voice now almost inhuman. "The moon, it's not just a rock. It never was. Whatever's down there, it was never meant to be discovered. And we, the fools that we are, woke it up. But what is it?" I was about to explode with questions. He stared at me for a long second before stepping back. "I can't say more, but never look for too long. When you see it, when you realize, that's when it starts." "See what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he shoved me out of the door and slammed it shut, leaving me standing on the porch under the now gray sky, threatening rain. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Never look for too long. The phrase echoed in my mind, even more disturbing for its lack of clear meaning. Harris knew something terrible, something he couldn't or wouldn't say. And more importantly, he seemed to be warning me that I had already gone too far. With my mind troubled, I returned to the car, feeling watched the entire time, as if the whispers I'd heard on the tapes were now hovering in the air around me. The only thing clear to me at that moment was that I was in danger. William Harris's warning echoed in my mind as I drove back to NASA headquarters. Never look for too long. But what did he mean by that? I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something not only beyond our understanding but also beyond our perception. I was certain the answer lay in the videotapes that had been conveniently forgotten in the archives. I knew that, no matter how damaged they were, modern technology could reveal something hidden. So, I took the most significant reel I could find, the one that seemed to document the team's lunar exploration during Operation Eclipse, and decided to bring it to a film restoration expert. I needed to see every frame, every detail, without the distortions and damage that had rendered the videos nearly useless for common analysis. The man I entrusted with the tapes was a discreet figure, someone with a name unknown outside the circles of historical film restoration. He worked in a small studio, filled with high-tech equipment, and accepted the job without asking too many questions. His neutral expression was one of the few things that gave me any comfort. That heavy atmosphere that had been following me for the past few days seemed less suffocating in his presence. "It'll take a while," he said, adjusting the film reels in a precision machine. "This is pretty deteriorated, but I think we can recover something. Just give me a few days." The days that followed were torturous. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of Harris pushing me out of his house resurfaced, his grim warning haunting me. The whispers I had been hearing at night now seemed more insistent, as if they were trying to guide me, or maybe warn me of something. But at the same time, I knew I was getting closer to something big, something the authorities had tried to erase but was about to be revealed. The price, however, was starting to seem higher than I had imagined. Finally, the day arrived. The restorer called me and said the material was ready for analysis. My heart raced the moment I answered the call. I knew there was something waiting for me in the depths of those tapes. When I arrived at the studio, he had everything ready. The low lights created an almost solemn atmosphere. He approached me as I entered the room, his expression more serious than last time. "I recovered as much as possible," he said, with a hesitation that hadn't been there before. "There's something strange in there, but you'll see for yourself." I sat in front of a large screen. The restorer hit play and the film began to roll. The hiss of the old recordings was still there, but the images were incredibly sharp compared to the original state. At first, everything seemed ordinary. A group of astronauts in bulky suits walking across the lunar surface, their steps slow and deliberate, their voices conversing through radios with communication glitches. Then the cave scene appeared. I immediately recognized the image I had already seen in the blurred photos. The astronauts gathered in front of the cave entrance that, according to reports, they had found almost by accident. The cave's image seemed artificial in some way. The smooth edges, a structure that didn't appear to be naturally formed. But what truly caught my attention was the back of the cave, an area obscured by darkness in the old recordings. In the restored footage, the lighting was clearer, and there was something there. The restorer paused the video, pointing to a strange shadow deep within the cave. It was something barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, but as the film progressed frame by frame, I began to notice outlines. A long humanoid shape, but wrong. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice low, as if we were afraid to draw too much attention to what we were watching. I couldn't respond. I just nodded slowly, my eyes fixed on the screen. The images continued to be restored. Now the astronauts were inside the cave, their steps slow and hesitant. The camera shook slightly. The operator seemed nervous, his focus erratic. Then, another frame captured something that made my heart freeze. A figure in the shadow, motionless, watching from afar. It wasn't human, Couldn't be. But it wasn't completely alien either. It had a vaguely familiar body, almost anthropomorphic, but the proportions were wrong. Its arms were too long, its head disproportionately large, and the gaze, although the facial details were difficult to discern. Something about the way that figure positioned itself sent a piercing chill through me. "This wasn't in the original version," said the restorer, with a hint of nervousness. "I checked several times, but that thing didn't appear until I restored each frame." The images continued, and what once seemed like harmless shadows began to look more defined. Each newly restored frame revealed more of those figures, sometimes just one, other times several, as if they were lurking around the astronauts. I could feel the tension rising in the explorers' own movements. It was as if they too felt they were being watched, but, like us, they couldn't fully see what was lurking. The feeling of being watched, which had been disturbing me for days, now seemed to ooze directly from the screen toward me. I shifted in my seat, glancing at the shadows in the room, sensing the invisible presence of something that shouldn't be there. "There's more," the restorer continued, heightening the tension in the air. He fast-forwarded the film a few minutes, and the group of astronauts was now deeper inside the cave. One of the crew members held a flashlight that, for a brief moment, illuminated what looked like a wall covered in symbols. Strange, intricate, almost alien, yet with an unsettling familiarity. The kind of thing that messes with your mind, like you're on the verge of understanding something your brain can't process. And then, in a final frame, the camera captured something I could never forget. One of those humanoid figures stood just a few meters from the astronauts, shrouded in shadows. Its features were completely distorted, as if the very image had been corrupted, but enough was visible for the horror to take over me. They had been there all along, hidden in the shadows, and the astronauts hadn't seen them. The restorer stopped the video, the tension in the air nearly suffocating. This shouldn't be there. None of this. I slowly stood, trying to process everything I had seen. Now, more than ever, I felt something lurking, not just in the old footage but around me. It was as if, by unearthing these images, I had brought those figures closer to me. Harris was right. Never look for too long. The restored images wouldn't leave my mind. The figures in the shadows, those humanoid shapes hiding in the lunar caves, I knew they weren't just artifacts of an old recording. There was something more, something that shouldn't have been there, yet was. Increasingly obsessed, I returned to the files, this time with a different focus. The astronauts had clearly found something in those caves, something beyond the figures in the shadows. And this discovery was directly linked to how Operation Eclipse ended so abruptly. What had forced them to end the mission so suddenly? What were those figures protecting? I was determined to find out. Days passed as I sifted through old documents, forgotten reports, and incomplete transcripts. Then something new surfaced, hidden among a pile of files that at first glance seemed irrelevant. A report labeled only as Lunar Anomaly Shadow Point. My heart raced as I read the title. Shadow Point was the same location mentioned in those reports that Harris and his team had investigated. Those caves, the figures in the shadows, and now an anomaly. I opened the report with trembling hands. The first few pages were descriptive, detailing the coordinates of the cave and excavation procedures. Nothing out of the ordinary until I got to the description of the discovery. A device buried beneath the lunar surface, covered by a layer of ancient dust. Metallic structure, seemingly of non-human origin. The device displays no recognizable technological characteristics. Measuring approximately 2.5 meters in diameter, its surface is covered with indiscernible symbols and engravings that do not correspond to any known writing system. It emits a faint glow, pulsing at irregular intervals. A pulsating device on the moon? My mind began to race with possibilities. I kept reading, but what came next made me stop breathing for a second. After removing the layer of lunar dust, the object began emitting weak radiation signals, which should not exist on the moon. The source of the energy is unknown but clearly active. Since its discovery, crew members have started reporting subtle behavioral changes and later, visual and auditory hallucinations. These manifestations were initially described as mild sensory distortions, but they quickly intensified. I stopped and read it again, my stomach churning. Hallucinations, behavioral changes. Harris had mentioned the voices. The recordings were full of static and whispers, and now this, it was the device, the key to it all. Something had been activated when they found it, something that should never have been touched. I continued reading, my mouth dry and my heart pounding. Crew member 03, identity restricted, reported seeing humanoid figures in the shadows of the cave, described as being made of pure darkness. Prolonged contact with the device appears to exacerbate these phenomena. In the days following the activation of the object, other team members began reporting similar experiences. In each case, the intensity of the hallucinations grew exponentially the longer they stayed at Shadow Point. The figures, the same ones that appeared in the restored videos, the ones the astronauts hadn't initially noticed but that had been there all along. The longer they spent near the device, the more they saw those forms. They were linked to the anomaly. I flipped through the report as fast as I could, eager to find something, anything, that would explain the function of the device. But, like other documents, the most crucial pages were missing. The narrative seemed to abruptly cut off after describing the effects on the astronauts. There was no explanation of what the device actually did, only vague reports of behavioral changes. But there was one last note, handwritten in the corner of a torn page. It wasn't the first time it was activated. I froze. It wasn't the first time. The implications of that phrase hammered into my mind. The device had been activated before? By whom? And what had happened that first time? I closed the file, trying to contain the flood of thoughts. Harris had suggested that something happened to them after contact with the cave and the anomaly, but he had never directly mentioned the device. Everything pointed to him knowing that something had been awakened on the moon. And now all those figures, those things I saw in the restored footage, were somehow connected to that object. I took a deep breath, but the air felt heavy, as if something invisible was closing in on me. The same feeling I had in the restoration studio returned with full force. I was being watched. I stood up abruptly, my eyes scanning the surroundings. The room was empty, but there was a pressure in the air, something almost palpable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment, I swore I saw a shadow move in the corner of the room. But when I turned my head, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the mounting tension, my mind playing tricks on me after days immersed in mysteries and paranoia. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever the astronauts had brought back with them, whatever had been activated in that cave, was closing in on me. Maybe it had been here all along, waiting for me to get close enough to notice. I stood there for a few more minutes, forcing myself to organize my thoughts. There was no turning back. I needed to fully understand what the device was and how it connected to Operation Eclipse and the figures in the shadows. Something had been activated, something ancient and beyond our comprehension, and I was getting closer to discovering what it was. But what awaited me? I was beginning to doubt if I even wanted to know. I left the room feeling that something new had awakened inside me, or perhaps around me. Harris's warning resonated louder than ever. Never look for too long. I had looked. Now those figures, invisible but present, followed me. And I knew they would only get closer the more I tried to uncover what, deep down, should never have been touched. The first nights after discovering the device were uncomfortable, but over time, the discomfort turned into something much more sinister. Now, when I lay down to sleep, there was no more peace. Each night transported me back to the moon, and the sensation was so real that waking up felt more like an extension of the nightmare than a return to reality. At first, the dreams were vague. I saw myself on the lunar surface, feeling the reduced weight of gravity, the vastness around me. There was no sound except for my own breathing muffled by the helmet of the spacesuit. But soon, the landscape began to change. The lunar horizon, desolate and inhospitable, was never completely empty. There was a figure in the distance, always on the edge of my vision, indistinct but impossible to ignore. Every time I looked directly at it, it moved, slowly, inexorably, approaching. The terror it provoked was inexplicable. I knew that the moment it got close, something horrible would happen. But it never got close enough. The fear was constant, like a nightmare hovering on the edge of revelation, but never allowing me to fully wake up. And then, when I finally did wake, the relief didn't come. The whispers were louder, more insistent, as if they had gained new strength, a new presence. At first, I tried to ignore them, convincing myself they were just remnants of the dreams. But it wasn't just that. They were with me all the time. At every moment, I felt the pressure of something invisible, as if I were being watched, followed. At the division headquarters, the atmosphere had changed. I wasn't the only one with that feeling. Walking through the halls and looking at my colleagues' faces, I could tell they were being affected too. The empty stares, the deep circles under their eyes, the hurried conversations. Everyone was on the brink of collapse, but no one spoke openly about it. It was as if an unspoken rule had been imposed. Don't mention the dreams. It was during a break that an unsettling truth began to emerge. I was in the cafeteria, trying to eat something while exhaustion weighed on my shoulders, when I noticed a small group of scientists whispering in the corner. Normally, I would have ignored it, but one word stood out among the murmur: dreams. I approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude, but unable to resist my curiosity. They looked at me suspiciously, but when they realized I already knew, they relaxed a little. "You too, right?" one of them asked with a pale expression. I nodded, not needing to say anything else. "We're all dreaming about it," said one of the researchers, a woman with a worn appearance, her voice almost breaking. "All of us are there on the moon seeing it, but no one talks, no one dares. It's like, if we talk about it, it makes it real." I silently agreed. There was something in her words that touched a part of me I was still trying to bury. If what we see in the dreams isn't real, why does it feel like it's becoming more and more present? The nights were unbearable, but what was happening during the day was starting to get even worse. Paranoia fully set in when the figures from the video recordings began to appear in irregular and inexplicable ways. While reviewing an old file from a routine lunar mission, one that had no connection to Operation Eclipse, I saw a shadow. It was subtle, but it was there. A figure at the edge of the frame, exactly like the ones we had seen in the restored footage. I began to notice these figures appearing in more and more videos, files that had previously been clean, with nothing out of the ordinary. It was as if something was slowly corrupting all the records, infiltrating the images, leaving traces of its presence. I wanted to believe I was becoming paranoid, that the astronauts' hallucinations and my own experiences were distorting my perception. But the truth was becoming increasingly clear. The figures were invading our reality. Frustrated and terrified by what was happening, I decided to confront my superiors. They knew something. There was no way a secret division like ours could handle so many discoveries and keep everything under control without prior knowledge of what was going on. Operation Eclipse wasn't just a routine mission that had gone wrong. There was something much bigger, something they were hiding from us. The meeting was scheduled last minute. I was summoned to an isolated room in the basement of the complex, a closed-off space with no windows, cold, metallic lights overhead. My superiors were waiting, their expressions neutral, as if they already knew what I was going to ask. "You want to know about Operation Eclipse?" one of the directors said, breaking the silence with a heavy voice. "You want to understand what was found there?" "I already know enough to know that something was brought back," I replied, feeling the tension rise in the room. "You knew there was something more on the moon, something we should never have touched." The director looked at me for a long moment before letting out an almost resigned sigh. "What do you know about contamination?" The word made my blood run cold. "Contamination," I repeated, confused. "What does that have to do with what we found?" "It has everything to do with it," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and loaded with something that seemed like fear. "When that team entered the cave and activated the device, they brought something back. Something that was never meant to be removed from there. Something." "What? You knew there was danger in that area? What were you looking for?" They didn't answer directly, but the exchanged glances between them said more than words. Whatever it wasn't an accidental discovery. They had been after it from the start. "You need to understand something," the director said. "What was found on the moon is beyond our comprehension. We call it contamination for lack of a better term. It's not something physical you can isolate or contain. It's an influence, something that clings to, infiltrates people into their minds." "An influence?" The words sounded empty and terrifying. "What did you bring back?" The answer didn't come. Instead, silence fell over the room, heavy and oppressive like a curtain. But before I could press further, one of my colleagues, a researcher I had known for years, passed by as I was leaving. With a tense look, she discreetly slipped a small note into my hand. I stood in the hallway, waiting for her to walk away before opening the piece of paper. "You are infected." The words were simple, but the meaning hit like a blow. I was infected? Something had infiltrated me? And how much time did I have before things got worse? I looked around, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. Harris's warning and my superior's words formed a mosaic of terror in my mind. I was closer than ever to understanding what was happening. But did I even want to find out what it meant? When I returned home that night, something was different. I was already used to the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. But this time, there was a darker feeling, an unease that followed me like a shadow. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, and the whispers, always present in the back of my mind, were now louder, like a constant buzzing. It was as if the air around me was electrified. In the hallway mirror, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. I stopped and took a few steps back, staring at my reflection, trying to figure out what was wrong. It was my face, of course, but there was something distorted. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a slight ripple, but when I moved to the side, my face elongated, warping slightly into impossible angles. I blinked several times, trying to clear my vision, but the mirror didn't lie. My face was there, but not as it should be. I slowly approached, my heart racing. The reflection seemed to flow, as if my own form was being pulled out of me, not physically, but perceptively. There was something in the mirror I couldn't describe. I could feel, with disturbing clarity, that the reality around me was beginning to give way, to warp in ways that didn't make sense. I brought my face even closer, trying to focus on the distortion, but the more I looked, the stronger the feeling of something being deeply wrong grew. My eyes, once familiar, now seemed strange, as if someone else's gaze was staring back at me. Something deep within my own eyes gave me a feeling of repulsion and dread. Harris's voice echoed in my mind. Never look for too long, but it was too late to stop. I had already looked. I pulled back abruptly, my chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were speaking directly to me, but their words remained distant, out of reach. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to regain control. I wasn't losing my mind. That's what I kept telling myself, even though everything pointed to the contrary. That night I couldn't sleep. The nightmares that used to torment me only when I fell asleep seemed to invade my consciousness even when I was awake. I began to sift through old files on my laptop, trying to find something to distract me. That's when I suddenly noticed something new. A folder that hadn't been there before, or at least one I didn't remember seeing. It was marked only with the word eclipse, a grim reminder of what I was trying to unravel. My heart sank as I clicked on the folder. Inside, there was a set of photos I had never seen before. Not images of lunar landscapes or mysterious structures, but of bodies. The bodies of the astronauts who had returned from Operation Eclipse. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The photos were grainy, blurry, as if something had corrupted the digital files. But when I focused on the figures, the truth became clear. They were deformed, not by something physical, not by any visible external trauma, but as if the very reality around them had been altered. Their features were distorted, stretched at impossible angles, just like my reflection in the mirror. Their bodies appeared displaced, as if they belonged to a dimension slightly misaligned with ours. It was as if the fabric of reality around them was being stretched and pulled in ways that didn't make sense. One of the astronauts had a completely unrecognizable face, his eyes displaced, his mouth twisted at a grotesque angle. Another was floating above the ground, but not due to zero gravity. The shadow beneath him was skewed, as if he were trapped between two worlds. These weren't deformities caused by some physical accident. It was something bigger, something that corrupted the perception of reality around them. I almost dropped the laptop when I saw the last photo. It was a sharper image without the visual distortions of the others. The astronaut in the photo was sitting, apparently lifeless, but his expression frozen in absolute terror. His skin, his features, everything appeared normal at first glance. But the eyes. His eyes were black, without pupils or shine, as if they had been drained of any trace of life or consciousness. They stared directly at me through the screen, and for the first time since the start of this investigation, I felt that what was in the photo could see me back. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the empty room. My heart was pounding, and sweat dripped down my temples. The evidence was there, but what did it mean? What the astronauts had found on the moon wasn't just a device, an unknown technology. It was something that distorted human perception itself. And now I was becoming a victim of it. I stood up, panic rising. My footsteps echoed through the house as I paced back and forth, trying to find some logic, some rational explanation. But all I could hear were the whispers. They were no longer just in the back of my mind. They were all around me. I passed by the hallway mirror again and, reluctantly, glanced at it. My reflection was there, but distorted beyond what I could bear. My face seemed fragmented, pieces of me floating in a reality that was no longer just mine. I blinked repeatedly, trying to dispel the vision, but nothing changed. The realization was clear now. I was changing. Not physically, but in a way that couldn't be measured or reversed. My understanding of reality was being corrupted, slowly distorted by something I had activated, something I never should have touched. I was going insane, or I was becoming something new. And for the first time, I began to doubt which would be the worse fate. I was trapped in an unbearable cycle. Between the terror in my dreams and the growing distortion of reality around me, I felt like I was being sucked into an invisible abyss. But there was something that still kept me standing, a spark of logic amidst the chaos. The truth was in the files. If there was any way to stop what was happening, or at least understand, I needed to return to the records of Operation Eclipse, no matter how much it was tearing me apart inside. After the revelation in the mirror, I hadn't had a night of rest since. The distorted reflection, the photos of the deformed astronauts, the whispers that now echoed incessantly, all pointed to the fact that what I found on the moon wasn't just an anomaly. It was something much deeper, more dangerous, something that was now trying to connect with me. I tried to avoid it, but deep down I knew it was beyond any control. The whispers were no longer just incomprehensible noises. They were speaking. It wasn't a human sound. It was broken syllables and disjointed tones, something that didn't make sense to my conscious mind. But somehow I understood them. It was as if my brain was adapting, being molded to decode that alien language trying to reach me. With this new understanding emerging, I returned to the Secret Division's headquarters, determined to dig through everything that was still hidden. Even amidst the growing terror, there was a part of me that craved answers. I needed to know what the device was trying to do. When I arrived at the archive room, the silence was oppressive. I could almost feel the figures from the videos lurking in the shadows around me, waiting for me to make a mistake. There was no one nearby. By now, the team seemed as exhausted and paranoid as I was. Each researcher avoided making eye contact, as if the mere act of looking at each other could trigger something none of us wanted to confront. With trembling hands, I began opening more folders and confidential files that had been filed under restricted. And that's when I found it. A completely hidden file, marked only with a numeric code, with no direct reference to Operation Eclipse. Inside was the truth I feared, but also craved. The first line hit me like a punch. The device recovered from the lunar surface has remained active since the moment of its discovery. Active? All this time, they brought it to Earth. How was that possible? I kept reading, panic growing with each new word. The device has not ceased transmitting signals. Our readings indicate that it is broadcasting something at regular intervals. However, what it's transmitting is indecipherable. The patterns do not match any code or frequency we can recognize, but we are detecting anomalous geomagnetic activity around the site where the device is being held. My fingers clenched around the edges of the paper, sweat dripping down my forehead. I knew what it meant. The signals were the whispers. That thing had been communicating, transmitting some message since it was removed from the moon. As I continued reading, everything started to make sense. The device had been brought back after the mission, and the team that recovered it was kept in strict quarantine for weeks until they began to show the first signs of contamination. Not physical, but mental. They started hearing the same voices I now heard, seeing the same distortions in reality that were now haunting me. A section of the report described what happened to those who spent too much time near the device. Initial symptoms include perceptual distortion, auditory and visual hallucinations. Victims report seeing humanoid figures in the shadows and hearing communication sounds at ultrasonic frequencies. As exposure time increases, individuals develop compulsive behavior, as if they are trying to understand or complete something initiated by the device. Compulsive behavior. It sounded terribly familiar. I was also being drawn, called by that thing, just like the astronauts. I kept scanning the pages until I found a line that made me feel as if the ground had collapsed beneath my feet. The device appears to be attempting to reactivate something. The word reactivate echoed in my head like an alarm bell. That's what it had been all along. This wasn't just an archaeological or technological discovery. The thing they found on the moon and brought to Earth wasn't dead. It was dormant. Those signals, the whispers, weren't just meaningless messages. They were part of a process, part of an attempt to wake something buried deep in time. Something that didn't belong to Earth, the moon, or even the solar system. Operation Eclipse wasn't the beginning of this. That thing had been there for far longer than we could comprehend, waiting, watching, feeding on those who discovered it. The astronauts were the first contact, the first physical connection with something beyond our understanding. And now I was the next connection. I felt a tingling in the back of my mind. The whispers, once confusing and distant, were now clear. They weren't just trying to speak to me, they were trying to transform me. The device had been the catalyst. When it was activated on the moon, it started a process that couldn't be stopped. It had the power to alter human perception, to shape the reality around us. And slowly, insidiously, it was connecting to me. I collapsed into a chair, my mind in a whirlwind. I wasn't just a victim of this. I was being prepared for something bigger. Now the whispers were sharp. They formed words, a language I had never learned, but one I understood perfectly. I was the next contact. The dormant thing was trying to reactivate through me. I closed my eyes, trying to fight the idea, trying to push away the weight of the truth. But it was useless. I had already gone too far. The figures in the shadows, the distortions, the nightmares. Everything was part of a larger process. Something the astronauts had only briefly touched and now, decades later, was finally coming to completion. I was the final step, and the dormant thing, whatever it was about to awaken. Whatever it was already here, and there was no stopping it. The world around me seemed to be crumbling, not physically, but as if my perception was being torn away, layer by layer. Reality, as I knew it, was no longer reliable. I no longer knew where my control ended and the entities began. But amidst this ruin, a truth began to emerge, and that truth was far worse than I could have imagined. As I reviewed the files again and again, something started to make sense. I already knew all of this. Harris's warning, "Never look for too long," wasn't about the immediate danger of staring at the figures in the shadows or confronting the disturbing recordings. It was something much deeper, something I had ignored until now. My mind began to race, every memory, every moment since the start of this investigation, twisting and warping into something new. This wasn't the first time I had accessed these files. The whispers, once distant and enigmatic, now became a single, clear, penetrating voice. It wasn't a call from the unknown. It was a memory, and it was pulling me toward a terrible revelation. The flashes of memory became more intense. I had already been here. I had reviewed the same files, looked at the same images, listened to the same recordings, and last time I had made the same decision. I had been involved in this research for far longer than I realized. But the thing inhabiting the device had distorted everything. My time, my memories, my very identity. Each time I delved deeply into the mysteries of Operation Eclipse, I lost a little more of myself. The warnings had been there all along, but I had never noticed. The device didn't just have the power to distort the perception of reality and time, it also altered memory, manipulated the past, as if it was playing with my very identity. I no longer knew who I was, how long I had been investigating, or how far the entity's control over me went. I had always been under the thing's control. The connection to the device had been made long ago, and each new cycle, each new attempt to understand what was happening, pulled me deeper. I saw myself now, sitting in that chair, like a puppet whose mind no longer belonged to him. There was no freedom. I had been part of this from the beginning, perhaps even before Operation Eclipse. The distortion of time and identity was complete. The figures I saw in the shadows? I was one of them. It was a reflection of what I was becoming, or perhaps had already become. The entity had been preparing me, molding my perception and my actions, erasing and rewriting my memories until I could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was fabricated. I looked at the mirror again, and this time what I saw was the truth. My face was no longer my face. It was a mask, a projection of the ancient thing that had long been taking shape inside me. The distortion I saw wasn't just a warped reflection. It was what I had become, and I had always known. Every fragment of memory I had suppressed screamed this at me. The alien thing had never needed to fight for control. I had always been part of it. I always had been. The truth hit me with the weight of a cataclysm. There was no more fighting against what was happening. The lunar device wasn't just a forgotten technology or a reality-distorting weapon. It was a channel for something far older, something that had waited patiently to reconnect with those who, like me, dared to activate it. Every attempt at resistance, every internal scream to regain control, was silenced by a growing presence inside me. I was no longer me. The entity, whatever it was, had won. But there was one last thing I had to do. One last thread of humanity fought within me, insisting that I warn the others before it was too late. The device needed to be destroyed. With trembling fingers, I typed a final message to my teammates. It might have been futile, but still, it was my last hope. The device must be destroyed. Don't touch it anymore. The contamination goes beyond what you imagine. I sent the message and stared at the screen, waiting for some response, some reaction. But before I could do anything else, I felt a cold wave sweep through my mind. The entity had fully invaded me. The whispers, once fragmented, had now become a single voice, no longer external but part of me. It wasn't speaking to me, it was commanding me. My thoughts were no longer mine. I was just an extension of it, a manifestation of something that had existed long before any human civilization. My body moved, but I no longer controlled my steps. I had become a tool. Harris's words, the images of the deformed astronauts, the figures in the shadows, it all made sense now. They too had been mere puppets like me. They had been the first contact, and I was just the next in line. The entity had waited patiently, using Operation Eclipse as the trigger, but the truth was that it had been there from the beginning, waiting for a moment of weakness, a moment when someone like me would open the door. Now, with the connection complete, there was no more Jonathan. My mind was fragmented, scattered in 1,000 directions. All that remained of me was a faint consciousness, buried beneath layers of the ancient thing that consumed me. In my final moment of lucidity, before I was completely lost, I understood the extent of the plan. The device wasn't just an artifact, it was a messenger. It didn't just contaminate human minds, it brought back something long forgotten. Something that had waited patiently to awaken and rewrite the world in its image. I tried to resist, but now I knew. It was too late. My eyes, which once saw the world from a man's perspective, were now the eyes of the entity. My mouth, once capable of speaking, now only served to transmit the whispers. In the end, the message I left for my colleagues would be useless. They, too, would be drawn in just as I had been. We had all become part of the ancient thing that had been awakened. The final contact had been made, and I would never be the same again. Now, I was part of what I had always feared. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next video that's playing on the screen.